November 23, 1952, 11:47 p.m. A warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront. The East River wind howled through broken windows, carrying the smell of salt, diesel fuel, and something else, something that smelled like death waiting to happen. 20 men stood in a semicircle, their weapons drawn, their faces hard as concrete. Sicilians mostly, soldiers from the Lucchese family, men who'd killed before and would kill again without losing a minute of sleep. In the center of that semicircle stood one man. No weapon visible, no backup in sight, no escape route. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across the concrete floor. Bumpy was wearing his signature charcoal gray suit, perfectly pressed, white pocket square folded with mathematical precision. His fedora was tilted at exactly the angle he preferred. Even surrounded by 20 guns, Bumpy Johnson looked like he was about to chair a board meeting. Vincent the Blade Caruso, captain of the Lucchese crew, stepped forward. His silver-plated .45 was aimed directly at Bumpy's forehead. "You got a lot of nerve walking in here alone," he said, his Brooklyn Italian accent thick with contempt. "Tommy Gagliano sends his regards, and his condolences." Bumpy didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show a flicker of fear. He looked at Vincent, then slowly, deliberately, let his eyes travel across every single man in that room. Counting them, measuring them, reading them like chapters in a book he'd already finished. Then Bumpy Johnson said 7 words that nobody in that warehouse expected. 7 words that made 20 armed killers freeze like statues. 7 words that would become legend in the New York underworld. "I know where all your families sleep." The warehouse went dead silent. Vincent's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Couldn't fire. Because in that moment, looking into Bumpy Johnson's eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Bumpy wasn't bluffing. He knew everything, and what he did next didn't just save his life. It changed the rules of power between the Italian mob and Harlem forever. Here's what nobody tells you about that night. Here's the story that never made the history books, the newspapers, the movies. This is the night Bumpy Johnson walked into death and walked out carrying the keys to Harlem's future. To understand what happened in that warehouse, you need to understand what Harlem looked like in 1952. The war was over. The boys had come home. The economy was booming for some people, but Harlem wasn't seeing that boom. Harlem was bleeding. The Italian families had been circling for years, ever since Dutch Schultz got killed in 1935 and left a power vacuum the size of Central Park. They'd tried to take Harlem before, tried to muscle in on the numbers racket, the policy banks, the gambling operations that generated millions of dollars a year from nickels and dimes bet by working people hoping to change their luck. But Bumpy Johnson had stopped them. Every single time. He'd formed alliances with Lucky Luciano back in the day, carved out territory agreements, established boundaries that the Italians mostly respected because the alternative was war. And war in Harlem was expensive. The community protected its own. You couldn't just send soldiers into Harlem and expect to walk out. Too many eyes. Too many people who'd seen your face. Too many ways for things to go wrong. But by 1952, the old arrangements were crumbling. Lucky Luciano had been deported to Italy. Frank Costello was fighting for control. The Lucchese family, under Tommy Gagliano, saw an opportunity. They wanted Harlem, wanted all of it, not a piece, not a partnership. Everything. And they'd decided that the only way to get it was to remove Bumpy Johnson from the equation. Permanently. The plan had been in motion for 6 months. Bumpy knew something was coming because Bumpy always knew. He had eyes and ears everywhere, bartenders, doormen, shoeshine boys, cleaning ladies who worked in Italian social clubs. People the mob never noticed, never thought to watch. These invisible soldiers reported to Bumpy daily, feeding him information about meetings, about movements, about whispered conversations in back rooms. By November 1952, Bumpy had pieced together the outline of the plot. The Lucchese family was planning to make a move. They were bringing in soldiers from outside New York, men with no local connections, no ties that could be traced. The hit was supposed to look like a robbery gone wrong, random street violence, nothing that pointed back to the Italians. But Bumpy didn't know when. He didn't know where, and he didn't know who inside his own organization had been feeding the Italians information. Because somebody had been talking. Somebody close. Somebody Bumpy trusted. That was the part that kept him up at night. Not the threat itself. Threats were constant in his world, but the betrayal. The knowledge that someone in his inner circle had sold him out. Bumpy had narrowed it down to 3 possibilities. Jerome Smooth Williams, his numbers coordinator. Clarence the Bishop Turner, his main enforcer. And Raymond Little Ray Patterson, his driver and personal assistant for 8 years. One of them was the traitor. Bumpy just didn't know which one. So he did what Bumpy Johnson always did when faced with an impossible problem. He set a trap. November 21, 1952, 2 days before the warehouse confrontation. Bumpy called a private meeting at his office above Small's Paradise. Only 4 people were invited. Jerome, Clarence, Raymond, and his most trusted advisor, a woman named Mame, his wife. Bumpy didn't speak when they arrived. He just sat behind his desk, studying each man's face, reading their body language, looking for the tell that would reveal the traitor. Finally, he leaned forward. "I've received word that the Lucchese family wants to negotiate. They're offering a partnership, 50-50 split on all Harlem operations." The room went quiet. Jerome spoke first. 50-50, that's robbery. We built this. They want half for doing nothing. Bumpy nodded. That's what I said, but they're insisting on a face-to-face meeting. Just me and their captain, Vincent Caruso. No weapons, no backup. Neutral territory. Clarence shook his head. It's a trap. Has to be. You walk in there alone, you're not walking out. Probably, Bumpy agreed, but if I don't go, they'll take it as a sign of weakness. They'll hit us anyway, and we won't see it coming. At least this way, I control the timing. Raymond, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. Where's the meeting? Bumpy looked at him. Warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront. Atlantic Avenue, number 1847. Saturday night, midnight. He watched Raymond's face carefully. Saw the slightest flicker in his eyes. The tiniest reaction. That was enough. Bumpy knew. Raymond Little Ray Patterson, the man who'd driven him for 8 years, who'd been with him through 3 assassination attempts, who knew his schedule better than anyone alive. Raymond was the traitor, but Bumpy didn't react, didn't let Raymond see that he knew. Instead, he continued the meeting like nothing had happened, discussed security arrangements, made plans that he had no intention of following, all while knowing that every word he said would be reported back to the Italians within hours. When the meeting ended, Bumpy pulled Mame aside. Raymond's the one, he said quietly. Mame's face went hard. You're sure? The warehouse location. Nobody knew it except me. I just gave it to the room. By tomorrow morning, the Italians will know exactly where and when to find me. That proves it. What are you going to do? Bumpy looked out the window at Harlem streets below. The same streets he'd protected for 20 years. The same streets that had protected him. I'm going to show up, he said. Mame grabbed his arm. Bumpy, that's suicide. They'll have 20 men, maybe more. No, Bumpy said slowly. That's strategy. They think I'm walking into their trap. But I'm going to turn it into my trap. And when I walk out of that warehouse, the Italians are never going to threaten Harlem again. Over the next 48 hours, Bumpy Johnson did something that nobody expected. He didn't gather soldiers, didn't stockpile weapons, didn't make plans for a counter-ambush. Instead, he did research. Bumpy understood something that most gangsters never learned. Violence is expensive. It draws attention, creates enemies, invites retaliation. The smartest way to win a war is to make sure the war never happens. And the way you do that is by having something your enemy values more than victory. Bumpy started with Vincent the Blade Caruso. Vincent was 44 years old, born in Sicily, came to America at age 12. He'd worked his way up through the Lucchese organization, starting as a runner, becoming an enforcer, eventually earning his captain's stripes by killing 17 men over 2 decades. He was feared throughout Brooklyn, a man who'd cut throats without hesitation, who'd buried bodies in cement foundations, who'd never shown mercy to anyone. But Vincent had a weakness. He had a family, a wife named Maria who he'd married when he was 22. 3 children, 2 daughters, ages 14 and 12, and a son, age 8. They lived in a brownstone in Bay Ridge, a nice neighborhood, quiet, safe. Maria took the kids to St. Agatha's Church every Sunday. The oldest daughter, Isabella, played violin in the school orchestra. The son, Antonio, was in Little League. Bumpy found all of this in 36 hours. His people followed Vincent's family, noted their routines, took photographs, gathered addresses. Not to hurt them. Bumpy would never hurt innocent people, especially children. But Vincent didn't know that. And what Vincent didn't know would become Bumpy's most powerful weapon. Then Bumpy moved on to the other 19 soldiers. It took time, but his network delivered. Wives, children, mothers, brothers, everyone had someone they loved, someone they couldn't protect if they were 1,000 miles away in a Brooklyn warehouse at midnight. Bumpy compiled everything into a leather notebook. 20 names, 20 families, 20 vulnerabilities. When he was done, he had something more powerful than any gun. Saturday night, November 23, 1952, 11:30 p.m. Bumpy Johnson's Cadillac pulled up 3 blocks from the Brooklyn waterfront. He was alone in the car. Raymond had offered to drive him, of course, probably planned to deliver him right to the slaughter, but Bumpy had declined. Told Raymond to take the night off. Enjoy himself. Raymond had looked confused, maybe suspicious, but hadn't argued. Bumpy sat in the Cadillac for 10 minutes, watching the warehouse from a distance. He could see figures moving inside through the dirty windows. More than 20. They'd brought extra muscle. They really wanted him dead. Bumpy picked up the leather notebook from the passenger seat. Flipped through it one more time. Then he tucked it inside his jacket, stepped out of the car, and started walking. The waterfront was deserted at this hour. Nothing but warehouses, shipping containers, the occasional rat scurrying through puddles of oil. The East River churned nearby, black and cold. A body dumped here would never be found. Bumpy walked without hurrying. His shoes clicked on the concrete. His breath fogged in the November air. He felt calm, strangely peaceful. He'd been close to death so many times that it had stopped scaring him years ago. The warehouse door was open. Yellow light spilled onto the loading dock. Bumpy climbed the steps and walked inside. 20 men waited for him. They were arranged in a semicircle, just as his informants had predicted. All armed, pistols, shotguns, one man with a Tommy gun. Enough firepower to turn Bumpy Johnson into a memory. Vincent Caruso stood at the center, flanked by his 2 lieutenants. He looked surprised when Bumpy walked in alone. Had probably expected him to bring backup, which would have given them an excuse to open fire immediately, claim self-defense, say Bumpy had made the first move. But Bumpy had come alone, unarmed, walking into their trap like a lamb to slaughter. Except Bumpy Johnson was no lamb. Bumpy stopped 10 feet from Vincent. Looked around the room slowly, meeting every man's eyes. Some of them looked away. Some tried to stare back but couldn't hold his gaze. Even with 20 guns pointed at him, Bumpy Johnson radiated something that made men uncomfortable. Vincent broke the silence. "I'm impressed," he said. "Didn't think you'd actually show up. Thought you'd send your boys, try some kind of trick." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "You asked for a meeting. Here I am. Let's talk." Vincent laughed. "Talk? We're past talking, Bumpy. This is business. Harlem's been operating independent too long. Tommy Gagliano's decided it's time for new management. You mean it's time for you to take everything we built and hand us scraps?" Vincent shrugged. "That's one way to look at it. The other way is, you walk out of here tonight, which, let me be honest, isn't going to happen, but if it did, you'd have Italian protection. Italian muscle. No more worrying about rivals, about police, about any of that. We'd handle it all, for a 60% cut." Bumpy raised an eyebrow. Thought it was 50-50. Vincent's smile widened. "Price went up. Consider it a convenience fee for the inconvenience you've caused us over the years." Bumpy nodded slowly, like he was actually considering the offer. Then he said the words that would change everything. "I have a counter-proposal." Vincent's smile faltered slightly. "You're not in a position to counter anything. You've got 20 guns pointed at your head." "That's true," Bumpy said calmly. "But before you pull those triggers, I need you to understand something." He paused. "I know where all your families sleep." The warehouse went absolutely silent. Even the East River wind seemed to stop. Vincent's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, a flicker of fear that he quickly tried to suppress. "What did you say?" Bumpy reached inside his jacket. Every gun in the room tensed. Fingers moved to triggers, but Bumpy didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out the leather notebook. He opened it to the first page. "Vincent Caruso," he read aloud. "Wife, Maria, 847 Colonial Road, Bay Ridge. You've been married 22 years. 3 children. Isabella, 14, takes violin lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays at the community center on Fort Hamilton Parkway. Lucia, 12, does gymnastics at the YMCA on Saturday mornings. Antonio, 8, plays Little League at Leif Erikson Park, games every Sunday at 2 p.m. Vincent's face went pale. "You son of a," he stepped forward, gun raised. Bumpy didn't move. He just kept reading. "Your mother, Conchetta, lives alone on 65th Street. Takes the bus to church every morning. Your brother Frank runs a bakery on 3rd Avenue, opens at 5 a.m., usually alone for the first hour. He looked up at Vincent. Should I continue? Vincent was breathing hard, his face flushed with rage and fear. The gun in his hand was shaking. You think threatening my family will stop me from pulling this trigger? Bumpy closed the notebook. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm explaining a reality. You have 19 other men in this room. Every single one of them has a family too. Wives, children, parents, brothers, sisters. I know where all of them live. I know their routines, their schedules, their vulnerabilities. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each soldier. And if anything happens to me tonight, by tomorrow morning, every single one of those families will know exactly what you did. Not know that you killed Bumpy Johnson, know that you put them in danger. Because my people have instructions. If I don't walk out of this warehouse by 1 a.m., they start making phone calls. Visiting homes. Leaving photographs on doorsteps. Photographs of your wives shopping, your children walking to school, your mothers going to church. Vincent's jaw tightened. You're bluffing. Bumpy's voice went cold. You've known me for 15 years, Vincent. Have you ever known me to bluff? The silence stretched. Vincent looked at his men. Some of them were exchanging nervous glances. Others were staring at Bumpy with something that looked almost like respect. One of the younger soldiers, a man named Sal who couldn't have been older than 25, spoke up. Wait, hold on, you're saying you've got people watching our families right now? Right now, Bumpy confirmed. As we speak, 20 teams, one for each of you. They've been in position for the last 48 hours. They have cameras, addresses, schedules. If I die tonight, your families won't be hurt. I don't operate that way, but they'll know. They'll see the photographs. They'll understand that their husbands and fathers and sons put them in danger. And they'll have to live with that knowledge. He paused. Some of them might forgive you. Others won't. Marriages will end. Children will lose trust in their fathers. Your mothers will wonder who raised you to be this way. That's the price of killing me tonight. Not war in the streets. Something worse. Doubt in your own homes. The warehouse had gone absolutely still. Even the wind outside had died. Bumpy could see the calculations happening behind Vincent's eyes, could see him weighing the options, trying to find a way out of this trap that didn't exist. Because that was the genius of Bumpy's plan. He wasn't threatening violence. He was threatening something the Italians couldn't fight with bullets: truth. Family shame. The destruction of the image these men had built as protectors and providers. He was threatening to expose them not as killers, which their families probably already suspected, but as failures. As men who couldn't keep their families safe from the consequences of their actions. Finally, Vincent spoke. His voice was tight, controlled, but Bumpy could hear the defeat in it. You think I'm afraid of some pictures. I think you're afraid of your daughter Isabella asking why there's a photograph of her walking to violin class on your kitchen table, Bumpy replied. I think you're afraid of your wife Maria asking how a stranger knew where your mother lives. I think you're afraid of looking your 8-year-old son in the eye and explaining why Papa's work followed him home. Vincent's gun lowered slightly, just an inch, but an inch was everything. This is between us, Vincent said. Our families have nothing to do with it. You brought them into it, Bumpy replied. You brought 20 men here to kill me. 20 men with families who love them, who depend on them, who trust them to come home safe. You weaponized your numbers against me, so I weaponized something bigger. I weaponized the truth about who you really are. Another soldier, an older man named Giuseppe, who'd been with the Lucchese family for 30 years, spoke up. He's right, Vince. This is messy. Tommy didn't authorize this kind of blowback. Vincent spun on him. Shut up, Giuseppe. We have orders. Giuseppe didn't back down. Orders didn't include our families getting surveilled. Orders didn't include photographs of my grandchildren showing up at my front door. He looked at Bumpy. How do we know you'll call off your people if we let you walk? Bumpy nodded. That's a fair question. Here's my guarantee. I'll leave the notebook with you. Every address, every schedule, every piece of information my people gathered. You can verify it. Check your own families. See if I'm lying. If I am, you come for me tomorrow and I won't say a word. If I'm not, he let the implication hang, then you know I'm a man of my word, and you know that going to war with me means going to war with a ghost who knows everything about everyone you love. Giuseppe looked at Vincent. This isn't a fight we can win. Vincent's face was twisted with rage, but Bumpy could see the fight going out of him. The younger soldiers were looking at each other, whispering. The older ones, the ones with families, had already made their decision. Finally, Vincent lowered his gun completely. The other soldiers followed suit, one by one, 20 weapons pointing at the floor instead of at Bumpy's chest. You think this is over, Vincent said quietly. This changes things, but it's not over. It is over, Bumpy replied. As of tonight, Harlem is off limits. You want to operate in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, that's your business. But you don't come north of 110th Street. Not now, not ever, and if anyone in your organization even thinks about threatening me or my people again, those photographs start circulating. Not to your families, to every newspaper in New York, to the FBI, to the other families, the Gambinos, the Bonanos, the Colombos. Let them see how exposed the Lucchese organization really is. How vulnerable. Vincent's eyes widened. That would start a war between the families. Bumpy nodded. It would, and it would end with Tommy Gagliano wondering why his captain couldn't handle a simple meeting without exposing the entire organization. How do you think that conversation goes, Vincent? Vincent was silent for a long moment. Then he did something Bumpy didn't expect. He laughed. It started as a small chuckle, then grew into something almost admiring. You're something else, Bumpy. You know that. Walk into a room with 20 guns, no weapon, no backup, and walk out owning the place. He shook his head. Dutch Schultz must be spinning in his grave. Bumpy didn't smile. Dutch Schultz never understood Harlem. That's why Dutch Schultz is dead. He tucked the leather notebook back inside his jacket. Changed his mind about leaving it. We're done here. I'll be at Small's Paradise tomorrow night, same table I always use. If Tommy Gagliano wants to discuss legitimate business, real partnerships where Harlem keeps what Harlem built, he can send someone to talk. Someone who understands that respect goes both ways. He turned and walked toward the door. 20 men watched him go. Not one of them raised a weapon. Bumpy Johnson walked out of that warehouse at 12:23 a.m. on November 24, 1952. He climbed into his Cadillac, drove back to Harlem, and went home to his wife Mame. He didn't tell her everything that happened. Just said the meeting went well. That they'd reached an understanding. Mame knew better than to ask for details. She'd been married to Bumpy long enough to understand that some things were better left unspoken. But she could see it in his eyes. The tension he'd been carrying for weeks was gone. Whatever had happened in that warehouse, Bumpy had won. The next morning, word started spreading. Through the underworld, 20 soldiers, 20 guns, and Bumpy Johnson walked out without a scratch. Different versions of the story circulated. Some said he'd bribed the soldiers. Some said he'd threatened their families. Some said he'd cut a secret deal with Tommy Gagliano behind Vincent's back. The truth was simpler and more profound. Bumpy had understood something that the Italian mob didn't. He understood that in the end, men don't fight for money or territory or power. They fight for the people they love. And if you can make them choose between a job and their families, they'll choose family every single time. By threatening to expose what the soldiers were really doing to their wives and children, not through violence but through truth, Bumpy had found the one weakness that all the guns in the world couldn't protect against. Shame. Vincent Caruso reported back to Tommy Gagliano the next day. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Nobody knows exactly what was said, but the result was clear. Tommy Gagliano accepted Bumpy's terms. Harlem would remain independent. The Lucchese family would stay south of 110th Street. In exchange, Bumpy would continue the informal cooperation that had existed for years, sharing information, staying out of Italian territory, maintaining the peace. It wasn't a perfect arrangement. There would be tensions and conflicts in the years that followed. But the fundamental boundary held. Harlem remained under Harlem's control. And Bumpy Johnson remained untouchable. But there was still one piece of unfinished business. Raymond Little Ray Patterson, the traitor. 3 days after the warehouse meeting, Raymond showed up for work like nothing had happened. Bumpy was waiting for him in the office above Small's Paradise. Come in, Raymond. Sit down. Raymond sat. He looked nervous, but he was trying to hide it. Heard the meeting with the Italians went well. Bumpy nodded. It did. They've agreed to stay out of Harlem. Raymond's face showed relief that seemed genuine. That's great news, boss. I knew you'd handle it. Bumpy was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the leather notebook and set it on the desk. You know what this is? Raymond looked at it, shook his head. That's every address, every schedule, every vulnerability for 20 Italian soldiers and their families. I spent 48 hours gathering this information. Bumpy leaned forward. But you already knew that, didn't you, Raymond? Raymond's face went pale. Boss, I don't know what you the warehouse location, Bumpy interrupted. Nobody knew it except me. I gave it to the room during our meeting. 4 people heard it, Jerome, Clarence, Mame, and you. Raymond started to speak, but Bumpy held up his hand. The Italians knew exactly where and when to find me. 20 soldiers, waiting. They knew I'd be alone. They knew the layout of the building. They knew everything, and there's only one way they could have known. Raymond's composure crumbled. He looked down at his hands, then back at Bumpy. His eyes were wet. How long have you known? Since the meeting, Bumpy said. But I suspected before that. Little things that didn't add up. Routes we took that seemed to have too many eyes watching. Schedules that changed at the last minute, and somehow the Italians always knew. Bumpy's voice was calm, almost gentle. Why, Raymond, we've been together 8 years. I treated you like family. Raymond's jaw tightened. Family, you paid me $300 a month while you lived in a penthouse. You called me family while I drove you to restaurants I couldn't afford to eat in. He looked up, defiance mixing with shame. The Italians offered me $5,000. Enough to get my mother out of that apartment in the Bronx. Enough to give my kids a real future. You think I wanted to betray you? I didn't have a choice. Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, there's always a choice. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out at Harlem streets. Do you know why I didn't tell the Italians about you? Raymond blinked. What do you mean? Bumpy turned back to face him. I could have exposed you. Told Vincent Caruso that my own driver was the leak. They would have killed you to tie up the loose end. But I didn't. Because despite what you did, I understand why you did it. I understand desperation. I've been desperate. Raymond stared at him. So what happens now? Bumpy reached into his desk drawer. Raymond tensed, expecting a gun. Instead, Bumpy pulled out an envelope and set it on the desk. That's $10,000. Enough to move your mother, set up your kids, start over somewhere else. Raymond's mouth fell open. I don't understand. Bumpy sat back down. You betrayed me, Raymond. I can't trust you anymore. I can't have you around. But you're not my enemy. You're a man who made a bad choice for understandable reasons. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take that money. You're going to leave New York tonight. You're never going to come back. And in exchange for my mercy, you're going to do one thing for me. What? You're going to tell the truth. Not to the Italians, not to the police. To your children. Someday, when they're old enough to understand, you're going to tell them about this moment. About the choice you made. And about the fact that I let you walk out of here when I had every right to put you in the ground. Raymond was crying now, tears streaming down his face. Why would you do this? Because Harlem taught me something, Bumpy said. Killing a man is easy. Changing a man is hard. I'm betting that you'll spend the rest of your life trying to be worthy of this second chance. Trying to prove to yourself that you're not the person who sold out Bumpy Johnson for $5,000. He paused. Am I wrong? Raymond shook his head. No, you're not wrong. Bumpy nodded. Then take the money. And remember this. Mercy is more powerful than revenge. Every man you spare becomes someone who might spare you someday. That's how Harlem has survived all these years. Not through war, through grace. Raymond picked up the envelope with shaking hands. He stood, walked to the door, then turned back. For what it's worth, he said, his voice breaking, you're the only man I ever respected. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, I know. That's why this hurts. Raymond left. He caught a bus to Chicago that night, never returned to New York. Last anyone heard, he was working construction, had gotten his mother into a nice apartment, put his kids through school. Never got back into the life. True to his word, years later, he told his children the story. Told them about the man who could have killed him and chose mercy instead. By the time his oldest son graduated college, the story had become a family legend, a reminder that redemption is always possible, that one moment of grace can echo through generations. The warehouse confrontation became legend in the New York underworld. Over the years, the story grew and changed, the way stories do. Some versions said Bumpy had an army waiting outside. Some said he'd poisoned the Italian soldiers' drinks. Some said he'd made a deal with God himself. But the people who were actually there, the 20 soldiers who'd lowered their guns that night, they knew the truth. They'd witnessed something they couldn't explain but couldn't deny. One man, armed with nothing but knowledge and nerve, had walked into certain death and walked out victorious. Not through violence, through strategy, through understanding that real power isn't about how many men you can kill. It's about how many men you can convince not to fight. Vincent Caruso, the man who'd been seconds away from killing Bumpy that night, became something unexpected in the years that followed. A friend, not a close friend, not a partner, but something like mutual respect grew between them. They'd run into each other occasionally, at functions, at neutral territory restaurants, at funerals for men who'd lived the life and paid the price. And every time they met, Vincent would look at Bumpy with that same expression, half admiration, half disbelief. Once, years later, at a Christmas party at the Copacabana, Vincent pulled Bumpy aside. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." That night, at the warehouse, Vincent hesitated. "Were you really ready to die?" Bumpy considered the question. Then he nodded. "Yes, I was." Vincent shook his head. "Then why did it? Why walk into that room alone, knowing you might not walk out?" Bumpy looked at him. "Because Harlem needed to know that their protector wasn't afraid. Because the Italians needed to know that killing me would cost more than they were willing to pay. And because sometimes the only way to avoid a war is to show that you're willing to die in one." He paused. "Fear is a useful tool. But courage is better." Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he raised his glass. "To courage, then." Bumpy raised his glass. "To understanding when to use it." Bumpy Johnson lived another 16 years after that night. He died in 1968, at the age of 62, from a heart attack. Not in a shootout, not in a prison cell, but in a restaurant, surrounded by friends, in the neighborhood he'd protected for 4 decades. They say that when he died, all of Harlem stopped. The numbers runners closed their books. The bars closed their doors. The streets went quiet. People who'd never met Bumpy Johnson cried like they'd lost a father. Because in a way, they had. He'd been Harlem's shield for so long that people had forgotten what it was like to feel unprotected. His funeral drew thousands. Politicians, musicians, hustlers, and working people lined the streets. The procession stretched for blocks. And somewhere in that crowd, there were men from the Lucchese family. Not there to celebrate, but to pay respects. Because even they understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. The warehouse story was told and retold that day. Old-timers shared it with young hustlers. Parents whispered it to their children. It became part of Harlem's mythology, right alongside the stories of the Cotton Club and the Harlem Renaissance and all the other legends that made the neighborhood what it was. But here's the thing that most people miss when they tell the story. It wasn't really about Bumpy's courage, although that was part of it. It wasn't even about his strategy, although that was brilliant. It was about understanding people. Understanding that the 20 men in that warehouse weren't monsters. They were fathers and sons and brothers. They had people who loved them, people they loved. And when forced to choose between following orders and protecting those relationships, they chose love. Every time, Bumpy didn't defeat them with threats of violence. He reminded them of their humanity. He gave them permission to step back from a fight they didn't really want. He offered them an exit that let them keep their dignity while keeping him alive. That's not something you learn in the streets. That's wisdom, the kind that comes from watching people, studying them, understanding what makes them tick. Bumpy had spent decades learning Harlem, and that night, he proved he'd learned something even more important. He'd learned everyone. So when people ask about Bumpy Johnson, when they want to know what made him different, why he's still remembered when so many other gangsters have been forgotten, this is the answer. He walked into a room with 20 armed men who wanted him dead. And he walked out by understanding them better than they understood themselves. I know where all your families sleep. 7 words that saved his life and changed history. 7 words that proved the pen, or in this case, the leather notebook, really is mightier than the sword. Harlem remembers Bumpy Johnson, not as a gangster, but as a strategist. Not as a killer, but as a protector. Not as a criminal, but as a king. And kings, real kings, don't need armies. They just need to be smarter than everyone else in the room. Bumpy Johnson was always smarter. He was always 3 moves ahead. And on November 23, 1952, he proved it to 20 armed men who walked in expecting to commit a murder and walked out having learned the most important lesson of their lives. You don't beat Bumpy Johnson with guns. You don't beat Bumpy Johnson at all.